Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought that I would review this little video that I found very particularly interesting. And this is going to be a video actually about quite a bit of topics. And the reason overall why I'm going to be talking about a multitude of topics is because this is really going to involve a certain amount of fighters, especially three fighters that I'm mainly going to be talking about in this video. And the three fighters that I'm going to be talking about in this video are, in my opinion, all top 5 pound-for-pound fighters. We're going to be talking about Terrence Bud Crawford. We're going to be talking about Errol Spence Jr. And we're also going to be talking about Mr. Sewell Canelo Alvarez. Now, a certain amount of you may ask overall, well, why are we going to talk about all three of these fighters in the same video? Because all in all three of those fighters, when we talk about their debatable pound-for-pound spot, if certain things transpire within the next year, within the next couple of years, depending on what ends up happening, there's going to be probably a great debate, maybe even a great separation, depending on who is out there and what they believe about who is the true #1 pound-for-pound fighter. And this is mainly overall what this video was going to be about. I actually overall wanted to talk about this probably last week, but I think all in all that more than likely this would make the video a little bit more interesting, a little bit more debate worthy. But basically what I'm going to be talking about in this video is if that Terrence Bud Crawford versus Errol Spence Jr. fight does end up happening, that mega fight, who overall will truly be the #1 pound-for-pound fighter in all of boxing? Would it still be Canelo Alvarez, in my view? And I've already stated a multitude of times that Canelo Alvarez, in my view, that he is the true #1 pound-for-pound fighter, just not only because of his skill set, but also because of clearly what he has accomplished. He is a four-weight division champion. He is a person all in all that is completely unified, in my view, a somewhat semi-talented division. And on top of that, when you talk about resume, there really is no other fighter out there. It really doesn't matter who you compare him with. You can compare him with Terrence Crawford, Alexander Usyk, Tyson Fury, Errol Spence Jr. You can compare him with whoever you want to out there. There is no fighter at the current moment in time that has the wins, the amount of wins and impactful wins on their resume as what a Canelo Alvarez has. And that probably is the main reason why Canelo Alvarez is on my #1 pound-for-pound list, because resume, in my view, is the most important thing that you can have overall, basically within your ranking. And resume, when I say resume, I'm not talking about someone that is just a multiple weight division champion. When I say resume, I'm talking about a person that has actually defeated A-class fighters and repeated A-grade fighters. And when you take a look at Canelo Alvarez has fought Caleb Plant, he's fought Billy Joe Saunders, he fought Callum Smith, all those fighters were undefeated. He fought Danny Jacobs overall, who probably was a naturally bigger opponent. He overall fought Sergey Kovalev, yes, a little bit more wore down, but still a decent opponent. He fought Austin Trout, Arizona Lara. He fought Gennady Golovkin and Miguel Cotto. He was able to get the victory over all those opponents when, in my view, they were A-grade fighters, and overall they were still champions in boxing. So my point being overall is this. When you watch a certain channel overall like this channel that I'm about to review here by Mr. AKHi TV, you have to be very careful basically with who you watch and who you receive your information from. Because there's going to be a certain amount of people, especially who have a very big racial issue, like Mr. AKHi TV does have here. And if you've seen this channel before, and if you're truly intelligent to know what he's truly about, you know that he has a very, very big racial issue, especially with a lot of the Caucasoid fighters. But he really has a big issue with a certain amount of the other fighters, all in all, as long as they're not the black American fighters or as long as they're not black fighters. This is why I call these guys' channel the pro-black cult. It just is what it is. That's what they are. It just is what it is. They are basically very, very big pro-black channels, and a certain amount of people, they may not like the term overall that I give them when it comes down to it, but it just is what it is. That's just what they are. It's just the truth. And at the end of the day, you have to be very careful, because basically what AKHi TV and Dante's Boxing Nation or Boxing Eagle or some of these other guys, basically what they'll have you believe is that Canelo Alvarez or someone like a Tyson Fury or Vasily Lomachenko or Gennady Golovkin, the only reason why they're ranked very high on the pound-for-pound list, and the only reason why, they get any credit whatsoever is because they just had the complexion for the protection. Now, don't get me wrong. There's certain examples overall to certain fighters or certain athletes that may be Caucasoid or maybe Caucasian that they get extra praise overall than that of black athletes or black fighters or other athletes, because maybe all in all they want to appeal to a certain amount of the demographic. And not only that, but maybe you can designate the term for them as the big white hope or the great white hope. You certainly can debate that. That has been a common thing overall throughout history. But don't try to tell me all in all that Canelo Alvarez, that the only reason why someone like him, who is a four-weight division champion, someone who has A-grade name after A-grade name after A-grade name on his resume, don't just sit here and tell me all in all that the only reason why he's ranked #1 pound-for-pound is because he's a Caucasoid or that he's a Caucasian fighter and that he has the complexion for the protection. Because if we really take a look at the facts, if we take a look at the logical and objective facts of the situation, that is not the case. People try to act like people try to act like basically that Canelo Alvarez, that he's just some Babe Ruth or something, to where basically all in all he just fights the weakest of the weak competition, or he was only fighting, basically strictly Caucasian fighters, and those Caucasian fighters weren't even truly 100% the best. And basically, for those of you that don't know what I'm talking about, Babe Ruth in baseball, and I don't really know a whole lot about baseball, but of course, if you do your research, Babe Ruth was a part of a time to where someone was restricted with basically who could play baseball. Canelo Alvarez has not done that within his career. So basically, what these guys always try to say is that, oh, well, Canelo, he's not fighting the best of elite of champions. He's not fighting this. But even when Canelo does possibly want to face them next, like that of a Jamal Charlo, or maybe someone overall that they've apparently been begging him to face for a very long time, they're not happy with Canelo Alvarez fighting that guy anyway. And the reason why that is because they have a very big racial issue, and they just don't want Canelo Alvarez to be the number one pound-for-pound fighter in the first place. But the main discussion of this video is going to be who is going to be the true number one pound-for-pound fighter within these next few years. Because if Terrence Bud Crawford or Errol Spence Jr., especially Terrence Crawford, wins that fight against Errol Spence Jr., which I do believe that is a 50-50 fight, and I'm going to tell you all in all who I believe may win that fight at the current moment in time, but we'll get to that eventually. Whoever is going to be the winner of that fight, there is going to be a certain amount of these people that basically push, all in all, either Errol Spence Jr. or Terrence Crawford as the number one pound-for-pound fighter. And at that point, I won't necessarily have a problem with that. This video was not meant for me to change your opinion, or basically well, I won't say that completely overall. I do want to get my point across when it comes down to it. But what I will say is that if you believe that the winner of this fight does truly deserve to be the number one pound-for-pound fighter, I'm not really trying to change your mind about that, because Errol Spence Jr. and Terrence Crawford, they both, in my opinion, are top 5 pound-for-pound fighters. And that is what Terrence Crawford and Errol Spence Jr., especially compared to Canelo Alvarez, in my view, that is truly what they're missing. They're winning a victory, or they're missing a victory, over a top 5 pound-for-pound fighter, a fighter that truly had a 50% chance, maybe even was possibly favored over them. Basically a Tommy Hearns, Sugar Ray Leonard, or Marvin Hagler versus Sugar Ray Leonard type of matchup. Canelo Alvarez was already in that matchup. His name was Gennady Triple G Golovkin. And the first time, even though I thought Canelo Alvarez, in my view, probably lost the fight, in the rematch, he was able to pull out victorious. So at the end of the day, that is the reason, in my view, why Canelo Alvarez is the true number one pound-for-pound fighter. But this is also going to get a little bit more interesting as well, because even the victor of this fight, if Terrence Crawford and Errol Spence Jr., whoever the victor of this fight will be, if Canelo Alvarez, because of the moves that he is making, by facing a Dimitri Bivol, someone who, in my opinion, is a top 15, top 20 pound-for-pound fighter in the whole world of boxing, and is someone that is decently bigger than Canelo, and is someone all in all that, in my view, can be looked at as a very dangerous fight for Canelo in a 50-50 fight. If Canelo ends up not only defeating Dimitri Bivol, but if he also ends up defeating the victor of Joe Smith Jr. versus Artur, which I predict will more than likely be Artur, the question will be, will Canelo Alvarez still deserve to be the number one pound-for-pound fighter in all the sport, or will Terrence Crawford or Errol Spence Jr. surpass him? And I think that that's going to be a very great debate. In my view, if Canelo Alvarez ends up unifying the light heavyweight division, I more than likely will probably keep him at my number one pound-for-pound spot. But anyways, we're going to see overall what Mr. AKHi TV has to say. Let's get into the conversation.
So after Errol Spence TKO'd Ugas in a dominant fashion, the pound-for-pound number one king Terrence Bud Crawford gave his reaction to Errol Spence adding another man down to his resume, where Crawford said, quote, "Errol Spence, congratulations, great fight. Now the real fight happens. No more talking, no more side of the street. Let's go." Wink and a handshake emoji. In addition to that, Bud Crawford told Errol Spence, "Keep my belts warm. I will be coming to grab him later this year." End of the quote. One thing for sure and two things for certain. This is the fight of the decade. There's no mistake about it. I mean, when is the last time we had two fighters on this level when it comes to skill and ability, who are number one and number two pound for pound, actually fight each other in their prime? We have to.
Well, I would not call Terrence Crawford and Errol Spence number one and number two, because neither of them are at my number 2 or number 1 spot. Now, that's not me disrespecting Errol Spence or Terrence Crawford. That's just me saying that I don't have them within my top 2. And a certain amount of people overall may disagree. At the current moment in time, I have Mr. Overall Canelo Alvarez at the number 1 pound-for-pound spot. And at the number 2 spot, I think you can actually debate a certain amount of fighters. If you wanted to debate Alexander Usyk, Terrence Crawford, Errol Spence, Tyson Fury, in my opinion, you pretty much, put their names in the hat, whichever one you pull out in whatever order. You can pretty much mix and match whatever you want to do. But at the end of the day, Alexander Usyk and Tyson Fury, what I will say about them is that they have those 50-50 once-in-a-lifetime matchups. They have victories over certain opponents like that. That Terence Crawford, in my view, overall does not have. And even Errol Spence Jr., it just is what it is. Now, don't get me wrong, Errol Spence Jr. and Terence Crawford, they deserve a lot of credit for what they've done. But there's no fight, in my opinion, that Terence Crawford has ever had in his career to where it was like the Alexander Usyk versus AJ matchup, where Alexander Usyk not only was overall going to be a tough fight for him, but he was not favored to win that fight. And Alexander Usyk was able to go in there and completely outbox him. Now, if you want to make the argument that Anthony Joshua is not quite the fighter that some of the other fighters, all in all, maybe that Errol Spence has fought, maybe you could possibly make that debate, but Anthony Joshua also was one of the best heavyweights in the world. So it's up to you. But anyways, like I said, so anywhere from 2 to 5 I think is very, very fluid with those fighters. But at the end of the day, I can't have Terence Crawford and Errol Spence Jr. I just can't have them at number 1, number 2. However, what I will say is this. I understand what AKHi TV is saying. This is a tremendous fight. This is one of those once-in-a-lifetime fights. This is one of those Mayweather-Pacquiao fights. This is one of those Tommy Hearns versus Sugar Ray Leonard or Sugar Ray Leonard versus Marvin Hagler fights. That's pretty much what this fight is on the level on. I also would put the level on Canelo Alvarez versus Gennady Triple G Golovkin, because Gennady Triple G Golovkin in his prime, he was a very, very big opponent. He was a person that was a very, very decently skilled opponent. That was a fight, in my opinion, that, AKHi TV, of course, is glossing over. But, of course, we know that AKHi TV, he'll discredit Canelo Alvarez in any way that he can. But anyway.
Go back at least 28 years when Roy Jones fought James Toney in 1994. That's the last time I can recall 2 fighters on this level who were actually ranked number 1 and number 2 pound for pound that possess that type of skill. This is how...
Well, I would have to see where James Toney was ranked back in the day. In my view, James Toney, I'm not sure if he ever was quite ranked, actually, on the number 2 pound for pound spot. But AKHi TV, of course, he kind of, in my opinion, he's exaggerating a little bit. This is a little bit hyperbolic, him stating that we haven't had a fight like this in 28 years. I don't think I would say that. Now, if you maybe want to say that Mayweather and Pacquiao, that they weren't 100% in their absolute primes, maybe you could debate that, but they still were at a very decent point in their career. But Canelo and Gennady Golovkin, which was a mega fight all in all, 2 top 10 pound for pound fighters at that moment, that was a fight. Those were 2 fights all in all between 2 great fighters who were both in their prime. And of course, there's going to be a certain amount of people that maybe say, oh, well, Gennady Golovkin was 36 years old. Yes, but just because you're 36 years old doesn't mean that you're not at the peak point of your career. When you take a look at certain fighters like a Bernard Hopkins, for example, Bernard was pretty much at the peak of his career once he hit his late 30s, even to his early 40s. Now, of course, a lot of people, they think that sounds ridiculous, but Bernard Hopkins aged differently than some other people. So there's just certain people all in all that are a little bit different. When Gennady Golovkin was 35, 36 years old, he still was at the peak of his career. Now, Gennady Golovkin, after the Canelo Alvarez rematch, that pretty much has been a Gennady Golovkin that has never been the same. But Gennady Golovkin, you can tell all in all that he was a monster for those 2 Canelo Alvarez fights.
Lucky we are if we end up witnessing this fight.
And another fight also that I would say would somewhat be on this level, at least to a degree, would be Andre Ward and Sergey Kovalev. Now, if you want to, maybe debate that Crawford and Spence, in your view, were more skilled than those guys, be my guest. But all I'm saying is this. We've had, tremendous, fantastic fights between 2 top 5 or 2 top 10 pound for pound fighters within the past 10 years, multiple times, several times. It's not like, this truly only happened, 28 years ago.
We essentially gonna witness something that haven't taken place for 28 years. Think about that for a second. Errol Spence and Crawford have so much skill that they can actually qualify to be superheroes. There's so much skill between these 2. This is like Goku versus Vegeta. This is our Leonard Hearn, Ali Frazier, Jones Toney, Mayweather Pacquiao. This is that type of a fight. On one hand,
I agree with you there. I do think all in all that it is one of those type of matchups. But this is also going to be another problem, in my opinion, in the pound for pound debate. And that is overall going to be the question, depending on your view on it. Will the winner of this fight truly be the number 1 pound for pound? Or will Canelo Alvarez still stay at his number 1 spot if he does beat that of Dimitri Bivol? Because even though Bivol, I wouldn't necessarily put him on the same level as a Crawford or a Spence, in my view, he is within the top 20 pound for pound. And Canelo Alvarez, in my view, he already won that matchup overall that was pretty much like that generational 50-50 fight against Gennady Triple G Golovkin. So Canelo had already taken care of business. But of course, one could make the point that Canelo Alvarez, that in that first fight, that he was not extremely dominant, that more than likely he probably should have lost that fight. and that he was somewhat given a gift by the scorecards. I certainly understand that. And that in the second fight, that even though Canelo Alvarez more than likely pulled out, that it was very, very close and still could have won either way. So maybe if Terence Crawford or Errol Spence Jr., if they can look extremely dominant in this fight, and let's say that one of them wins this fight 9-3 or 8-4, even though I doubt that would happen. Let's just say, I don't know, for hypothetical reasons that it would happen. Maybe could you then debate one of these guys over Canelo Alvarez as the #1 pound-for-pound fighter? You could, but in my opinion, it's going to be very difficult, especially if Canelo overall does beat that of Dimitri Bivol and then go and defeat Artur Beterbiev, because if Errol Spence Jr. ends up defeating Terence Bud Crawford, it'll be a great win and a fantastic win, and it'll clearly even up his resume to, what it even was before. But the problem is that he only has work within one weight division. Canelo Alvarez is a full weight division champion, and he's fought 8 great fighters in every single one of those weight divisions.
You have boxing pound-for-pound #1 Crawford coming off his biggest win yet, knocking out Shawn Porter, a fighter that had never been stopped before. A fighter who had the best resume in boxing back when Crawford fought him. On the other hand, we have Errol Spence.
How can you claim that Shawn Porter has the best resume in boxing when he basically lost almost every big fight in his career? Now, don't get me wrong, it's a great win. That's not me trying to degrade what Terence Crawford did against Shawn Porter, but that's why Terence Crawford, at least as of yet, he cannot be my #1 pound-for-pound fighter, because the best win in your career was against the Shawn Porter. Now, don't get me wrong, Shawn Porter, in my view, if I wanted to be like an AKHi TV or someone else, I could clearly state, when they're full of shit, when they always try to tear down Canelo or another fighter, I could be like, oh, well, he fought Shawn Porter when he was more wore down and he already had a few losses. Yeah, but just because a fighter has a few losses in their career doesn't mean that they're not at the best point, or overall that they're not at a very decent point in their career. Shawn Porter, for example, he pretty much was the best he ever was going to be when he fought Terence Bud Crawford. It's just that Terence Bud Crawford probably was the best opponent that he ever potentially faced. And now that we're really going to get into that conversation, if you're asking me, who do I personally think is going to win the Terence Bud Crawford versus Errol Spence Jr. fight, I personally believe more than likely that Terence Crawford would win. I just think that his footwork, I think that his power, and I think that his athleticism is going to give Errol Spence Jr. problems. And I think that Terence Crawford is really the only top possible style, in my opinion, within that welterweight division, or really even within the 154-pound division that I see, that really even has a chance of beating Errol Spence Jr. Because I don't think that there's anyone else that's going to beat Errol Spence Jr. within that 147-pound division. I certainly don't think anyone at 154, unless it's maybe Brian Castano, is going to defeat that of Errol Spence Jr. Jamel Charlo is certainly not going to do it. He just doesn't have the boxing ability. He doesn't have the boxing craft. And to be quite honest with you, I don't even think that he is even the athlete that Errol Spence Jr. is. But it is what it is. But that Terence Bud Crawford versus Errol Spence Jr. fight is going to be quite particularly interesting. But I do believe that Terence Crawford, in my view, unless we're talking about the chin, maybe slight defense, although their defenses, in my opinion, are around the same, and maybe power. Terence Crawford, in my opinion, pretty much has the advantage in every other category, including hand speed, footwork when it comes down to it, possible head movement. I think that is going to give Errol Spence Jr. a lot of problems. But after taking a look at his performance yesterday, this still is a fantastic fight. It's a 50-50 fight.
The #2 pound-for-pound, who just man down the dark horse of the welterweight division, Ugas, where Errol Spence chopped down the Cuban sensation in such a skillful fashion. That was artwork the way Errol Spence performed last night. He completely tore down one of the most skillful fighters and one of the most game opponents in Ugas, where Errol Spence literally snatched his soul. Now, the scary part, even though Errol Spence looked better than...
And notice that AKHi TV gives Errol Spence Jr. all the credit in the world for beating Ugas, who, let's also keep in mind, I believe had 4 or 5 losses already on his record. Now, don't get me wrong, if I wanted to be disingenuous, I could basically state that, Ugas, he really isn't that good because he has 4 or 5 losses. But if we're being logical and objective, we all know that Ugas has improved, and just because you suffer a few losses in your career, especially early on, does not make you a great fighter. But remember that these are the same channels that when Vasily Lomachenko, when he lost his, fight against Orlando Salido, and then eventually all in all was being ranked high in the pound-for-pound list, and deservingly so. What were they saying? He really wasn't better, that he just fought fighters that he cherry-picked. And it was the same thing for other fighters. But then other fighters of a certain complexion, let's be real, like an Erickson Lubin, what did they say? Oh, well, Erickson Lubin has a great career ahead of him. He just, suffered some unfortunate luck. So like I said, these channels, they have a very, very big racial issue. All right, it is what it is. I have no problem with certain people cheering for their own. AKHi TV, he's not even cheering for his own. He's just, he's pretty much what we would call overall wigger white boy. but it is what it is. But anyways, AKHi TV, when it comes down to it, I don't mind for people cheering for certain fighters, cheering for their own, no problem with that. But when you try to spread around certain narratives when it comes down to it, especially with your biased bullshit, that's over when I have to step in and say, no, this is incorrect.
Remember, this is Errol Spence coming off an eye injury and nearly a 2-year layoff.
Because let's remember what they said about Canelo Alvarez when he was facing someone like a Danny Jacobs, someone overall of that sort, someone who was an A-grade fighter when Canelo Alvarez fought them. What did they say? Well, of course, Canelo Alvarez goes after the fighter, all in all, the black fighter that, is not undefeated. Even though Danny Jacobs, he's pretty much on that same level as Jamal Charlo, and in my view, Demetrius Boo Andrade anyway. But anyway.
This was supposed to be a tune-up fight.
Because they did not mention overall, basically, the categories, or they did not mention the context behind it. Yes, Danny Jacobs had already suffered a loss, but when it came down to it, Danny Jacobs suffered a loss several years prior. And then overall, basically, ever since then, he learned from it and he became a champion a multitude of times. He overall was in, very decent fights, had very decent wins. So Danny Jacobs was at the best point in his career. But they won't mention that. But then when it comes to someone like Ugas against Errol Spence Jr., or when it comes to Isaac Pitbull Cruz against Gervonta Tank Davis, what do they say? Oh, well, those were elite opponents. So, like I said, we all know these channels. If we truly know what we're looking at, they're full of shit anyway. But anyway, now don't get me wrong. That's not me trying to degrade some of those wins. What Errol Spence Jr. had yesterday, very, very decent win. Unfortunately for Yordenis Ugas, I just don't think that he's an A-grade level fighter.
Errol Spence treated Danny Garcia and Ugas as tune-up fights, even though they are top-notch, world-level class fighters. This ain't no Avini, Rocky Fielding, Makabu, to-go. Errol Spence is cut from a different...
And of course, there is a shot at Mr. Canelo Alvarez, as he always has to throw a shot at Canelo, because he is obsessed with tearing down Canelo Alvarez's career. Because he is the main pound-for-pound king, they have to tear him down because he is the main threat. Years ago, it was Gennady Golovkin or Sergey Kovalev. Then overall, it was Vasily Lomachenko, and now it's Canelo. And don't get me wrong, there are certain fighters that may be promoted overall over certain other, demographic of fighters because overall they want it to be that way or they want them more hyped up. I get it. But listen, at the end of the day, like I said, if you're trying to just make the argument that Canelo was just ranked number one pound for pound because of his complexion, no, sir, I'm sorry, that's incorrect. The reason why Canelo was ranked number one pound for pound is because, all in all, Canelo, he has the resume and he has the skills to pay the bills. Not only that, but when you take a look at his accomplishments, dude has unified a very decently talented division. When it came down to certainly more talented than what Terrence Crawford unified. I'm just being real. It is what it is. And on top of that, Canelo, he's a 4-weight division champion. He has the best resume in boxing. And he's debatably up there with any skilled boxer in the world of boxing today, including Terrence Crawford, Tyson Fury, Errol Spence, and Alexander Usyk. That's why Canelo Alvarez, in my view, deserves to be ranked as the number one pound for pound. So let's keep things straight.
After a car accident where Errol Spence survived in a miracle way, after a career-ending eye injury, Errol Spence chose to tune up Danny Garcia and Ugas as his comeback fights. Talk about being a dog. Errol Spence ended up dogging both Danny Garcia and Ugas. Furthermore, another thing that I was highly impressed from Errol Spence was his durability when he was fighting Ugas. How well and quickly Errol Spence recovered when Ugas hurt him in the 6th round.
That's another thing that's very interesting as well. And not to, bitch and moan too much here overall and talk about certain double standards, but once again, just to show you what these channels are truly about, Dante's Boxing Nation and AKHi TV, especially looking at Canelo's sparring videos, what have we heard from them? They take a look at Canelo getting hit with one jab, and basically the reason why I mention this is because I believe that it's important, because they also try to tear down Canelo Alvarez's skill set, and they say that his defense is so poor, and that's why he gets hit with jabs, and he gets hit at will against Billy Joe Saunders and Caleb Plant and Sergey Kovalev. Canelo Alvarez never got hit at will in those fights. In fact, the majority of the time, he usually was blocking those punches. When you take a look at Errol Spence Jr. and Terrence Crawford, you can debate that Errol Spence Jr. in this fight against Yordenis Ugas got more hit overall than what Canelo did within his past, well, at least within his past fight against Caleb Plant, or around the same amount. One thing I'll tell you is this, is that Canelo, I haven't seen him hurt within his past few fights overall, within basically, getting hurt as much as what Errol Spence Jr. did. Now, of course, one may also argue that, he certainly did not face a power puncher overall, in Caleb Plant and Billy Joe Saunders, and that would be a fair point. So maybe that's not something overall that you want to compare directly, but like I said, if this was another fighter that they did not like a Tyson Fury or Vasily Lomachenko, they'd be saying, oh, he got exposed. This wasn't really that great of a performance. So, like I said, you just have to really keep watch overall and see what they say, depending what fighter it is. But I thought Errol Spence Jr., besides that sixth round with a little bit of a blip on it where he did get hurt a little bit, Errol Spence Jr. did recover very decently well. And all in all, I would give him probably at least an A, if not an A plus for this performance.
Knocking his mouthpiece out. I believe Errol Spence buckled a couple times. However, he quickly recovered, just like when Floyd Mayweather got hurt by Sugar Shane Mosley, and quickly recovered in that same round. That's exactly what happened with Errol Spence. He got hurt, but quickly recovered just like Floyd Mayweather did. Which this is something the bull.
Errol Spence, when it comes down to what he really reminds me of, he pretty much reminds me of a smaller version of Marvin Hagler. That's what he kind of reminds me of. He can box in a multitude of ways, but he is a person that is mainly going to try to come to you. He has excellent power for the division. He mainly is going to try to go in there, get overall within your range, and break you down incrementally. Terrence Crawford is a little bit more of a Sugar Ray Leonard style, in my opinion. And that, in my view, overall, is what it was going to take, in my opinion, to beat Marvin Hagler. Overall, it was going to take a person that not only was, not afraid to exchange with him here and there, but is a person also that has great footwork, faster feet than that of Marvin Hagler, a person that can move quicker, a person that can move very well in and out, overall faster hand speed, and a person that can somewhat, maybe keep him off a little bit here and there because of his punching power. And I think that Terrence Crawford is the style to do that against Errol Spence Jr. I believe personally that Terrence Crawford will more than likely beat Errol Spence Jr., but it's really close. If Errol Spence was able to beat Terrence Crawford, I would not be shell-shocked either because, Terrence sometimes he does get hit a little bit more than what you would like him to. I do think all in all that Terrence Crawford does not have as good of a chin as what Errol Spence Jr. has. It's just going to be very interesting. We'll see what happens.
Well, Errol Spence definitely needs in his arsenal when he charges at the Matador, Terrence Bud Crawford, who happens to be a knockout artist. More importantly, Errol Spence cannot afford to make...
The Matador, in my opinion, is a very decent name for Terrence Bud Crawford because that's exactly what he's going to do in that Errol Spence Jr. fight. And Errol Spence Jr. is going to have to adapt on the fly against Terrence Bud Crawford pretty much like how he did within these past couple of fights. Because Terrence Crawford, he's going to be a mover. Not only that, but he's also going to be an athlete that Errol Spence Jr. has never seen before. And vice versa. Terrence Crawford has never been in the ring with someone that has the punching power and someone all in all that has the fight IQ and the fighting ability of that as an Errol Spence Jr. That's why both of them are really going to have to be 100% on their A-grade game. Because this is a fight that either of them could lose if they don't play their cards right.
The rookie mistake he made on his last two fights against Danny Garcia and Ugas, where for some odd reason his mouthpiece fell out, and Errol Spence turned his back looking for the mouthpiece during the actual fight. Now, I don't care if the referee said stop or whatever the case may be. At the end of the day, or at least the night, you have to protect yourself at all times inside of that squared circle. That's literally the number one rule. For Errol Spence's sake, this better be the last time Errol Spence looks around for his mouthpiece during the actual fight. Because what's concerning is not that his mouthpiece went out. Absolutely not. That's normal. What's concerning is that Errol Spence is looking around for his mouthpiece during the actual fight. Now, if Errol...
What I'll say is this, because some people or some of you commentators may ask me, well, what do you think overall, do you think that Errol Spence Jr. is going to get hurt by Terrence Crawford? I think that either or gentlemen overall could get possibly hurt by one another because I think that they both have a great punching power for that weight division. I think that Terrence Crawford does not have as good of a chin as Errol Spence Jr., but I also think that he's decently better with the movement and the footwork. So, well, I don't think that Errol Spence Jr. has bad footwork. I just think that it's slow compared to Terrence Crawford. So let me just put it that way. That's why this fight is going to be particularly interesting. Because more than likely, Errol Spence Jr. is going to have to come towards Terrence Crawford. He's going to have to try to break him down. That's what he's going to have to do. Because in my opinion, if he tries to outbox Terrence Crawford in the middle of the ring or on the back foot, I don't think that it is going to work. But we'll see all in all what happens. And Terrence Crawford, there's going to be certain times where he will have to exchange with Errol Spence Jr. or he is overall going to have to back him up, which in my opinion, he does have the ability to do. And there's going to have to be times where I said that, Ugas, hopefully for his own sake, was going to do this, but I knew more than likely he wasn't going to be able to because he doesn't really have fast feet. He's not a person that really utilizes his feet at a great degree. Terrence Crawford knows how to do that. So Terrence Crawford, there's going to be times where he has to brawl with Errol Spence, or at least, put him off him, back him up. And there's also going to be certain times where he has to move in and out a lot. He's going to have to use his feet. That is going to be a main advantage that Terrence Crawford has over Errol Spence Jr. in that fight. But we'll see what happens.
Makes a rookie mistake like that against Crawford, that will be the end of the night for Errol Spence, because that will end up being the last mistake he makes fighting Crawford. So Errol Spence better tighten it up when it comes to that department. Last but not
Well, they both have to tighten it up in certain departments. Terrence Crawford, in my opinion, has to get a little bit better defensively. And Errol Spence Jr., he's going to have to be even a little bit quicker with his feet overall than what he's used to. And Errol Spence does not really have that quick of feet. But because overall he has very good defense, very good athleticism and power, and all in all he has very decent timing and very good adaptability on the fly, he can kind of get away with it. But Terrence Crawford is a person that he utilizes his feet very well. But what Terrence Crawford will also have to do is that he needs to improve that defense. He does get better defensively as the fight goes along a little bit later on, but Spence is going to be a person where that type of power, I don't know if Terrence Crawford has ever felt that before. But we'll see, all know what happens.
least,
But of course, one could also argue the other way as well, that Spence has not really felt Terrence Crawford's power either. But we'll see what happens.
there are a lot of people asking, what outlet has Crawford and Errol Spence as pound for pound number 1 and number 2 in the sport of boxing? Well, that would be new media. We do. New media pound for pound list is the most reliable and credible pound for pound list in all of boxing. Unlike old
Well, not really. But let's hear overall what AKHi TV has to say, ironically, within this next sentence.
media biased pound for pound list that fits their agenda of deceiving the public in order to promote the fighters on the hope list as the best, regardless if they lost or even cheated. They willing to
Right, AKHi, I get your point overall to a degree, but let's be real. Is saying that Canelo Alvarez is the number 1 pound for pound fighter, is that really trying to deceive the public? And is that why there's even a certain amount of black fighters like Devin Haney, Gervonta Tank Davis, and even Jamal Charlo, who is a possible contemporary of Canelo Alvarez overall, or a person that could be a future competitor of Canelo? Is that why there's a certain amount of black fighters stating that Canelo is the number 1 pound for pound fighter? So come on, let's cut the bullshit. All right, basically what new media is, and I've already stated this, they're almost like the BET channel. that's basically what they are. They want everything black when it comes down to it. They're just a big pro-black cult. That's what they are. That's why whenever you take a look at the top 10 pound for pound list, the only Caucasoid fighter or any fighter of any different graphic that you're going to see on there is overall Josh Taylor. Because they know if they rank him high and that if Terrence Crawford or Errol Spence beats him, then they know that they can put him that much more higher overall on a pedestal. But they're not going to put Canelo Alvarez, Tyson Fury, Vasily Lomachenko, or any of those fighters, or Alexander Usyk high overall within their pound for pound list because they don't want them there. So no, their pound for pound lists are not reliable. Basically, their pound for pound lists are basically this: what amount of black fighters, or what black fighters can we put on this pound for pound list? How many black fighters can we basically put on this pound for pound list? And if you don't believe me, go ahead and take a look at other channels like Champside. He'll put certain fighters, even like a Jaron Boots-Ennis, someone who hasn't even won a belt yet at that point in time in his career, this point in time in his career, basically because he believes that he's going to be a future champion. And don't get me wrong, I understand the thinking. But you can't put someone all in all within your top 10 pound for pound list who's never even won a belt in his career. So it just is what it is. We have to go off of results. We have to go after, data. We have to go after their resume, even if you believe that this certain fighter is more talented than this other fighter. It just is what it is. There's certain fighters, I believe that Shakur Stevenson, for example, I believe that he's more talented than a Josh Taylor, at least just taking a look at him on the surface. But I can't put him above that of a Josh Taylor at the current moment in time because Josh Taylor completely unified a very decently talented division. And Shakur Stevenson, he does not really even have debatably, in my view at least, one definitive A-grade win in his career. So we have to go off of results.
erase their losses. They're willing to erase their history of cheating. So they turn the pound for pound list from being the best to being the most liked, the most popular. That's why.
Well, that would make sense, AKHi, if someone overall like a Gennady Golovkin on most of these lists was still a top 10 pound per pound fighter. Or maybe if someone overall like a Sergey Kovalev was, or maybe someone overall, someone that doesn't really have a lot of platitude. But putting fighters like a Tyson Fury overall, or Alexander Usyk or Canelo Alvarez on a top 10 pound per pound list, or even within your top 5, that's not a big deal. It's not a big deal at all because those fighters deserve to be there. So it is what it is. And like I said, these channels, they're so full of shit anyway. AKHi TV, he'll put certain people like Jaron Boots or Deontay Wilder, people who don't have that great of a resume, up on his top 10 pound for pound list, basically because they're black fighters. So let's let's keep it funky. Let's keep it real. It just is what it is.
If we're talking about the best at fighting right now, then that's no other than Crawford and Errol Spence.
Well, the best at boxing right now, not only just in terms of the skill set, but also in terms of the resume, which is something that they always used to complain about when it came to Vasily Lomachenko and Gennady Golovkin or someone else of a sort. But then when it comes to certain fighters like a Jaron Boots or Deontay Wilder, all of a sudden they have no problem with it anymore. You know, resume does have to be counted in. And I don't really trust a lot of other pound for pound lists. I create my own pound for pound list as well. And right now, Canelo Alvarez, he is my #1 pound for pound fighter. Overall, I believe that that is the most objective and logical reasoning that I at least can come to. But it is what it is. Anyway.
But clearly, they have the complexion for the neglection, which that's where new media comes to the equation. New media agenda, narrative, or whatever you want to call it, is the whole absolute truth. And
no, it's not the whole absolute truth. It's to be a pro-black cult. New media's objective is to basically cover black fighters in the best light that they can. And I really don't have a huge problem with that. I think that that can be a very great platform. But they take it a little bit too far. And the reason why they take it too far, all in all, is because when you take a look at it, they're very biased towards certain fighters overall. And basically what they have become is a pro-black cult. They're not overall just a channel that covers black fighters in a better light or in a respectful and a fair and objective light. You have to be fair, you have to be objective, you have to be logical at the end of the day. And these channels are not that. They're very highly emotional. They have a very big racial issue. And that is why I call them the pro-black cult. It just is what it is. Because that's what they are.
Your brother AKHi always put it together like puzzle. Nevertheless, the fight of the decade must happen next. As this
Your brother AKHi. This dude really overall really this dude really overall really wishes that he was a black man. It just is what it is. Anyway.
It has been a half a decade in the making. So the fight must happen now or never for the undisputed pound for pound #1 king in the sport of boxing. There is no bigger accomplishment to achieve in the sport of boxing.
Well, that is going to be the interesting question. But I don't necessarily have a problem with someone stating that the winner of this fight will be truly the #1 pound for pound king. I really don't have a problem with that whatsoever. What I will say, however, is this, and this is a big part of the reason why I made this video. Canelo, in my view, more than likely, especially if he wins against those light heavyweights, he more than likely is still going to have a debate in that. And the reason why that is because Errol Spence has not really worked outside his weight division. And not only does Canelo Alvarez, in my view, clearly have a better resume than both Errol Spence Jr. and that of Terrence Bud Crawford. But if Canelo Alvarez completely unifies out of the light heavyweight division, I don't see how anyone is going to surpass him. Even if Terrence Crawford or Errol Spence, let's say, they move up at 154 and beat Jermell Charlo. Because let me just ask you something. Now, some people may disagree with me here. They may think that I'm going a little bit too far here. And they may say, well, you know, I don't agree with you on this. I think that that's crazy. But let me ask you something. Because this is truly what I believe. I think that Dimitri Bivol and Artur Beterbiev, I believe that they're bigger threats and more skilled fighters towards Canelo Alvarez than what overall Jermell Charlo would be. Let's just say overall, if he ends up winning, then what he would be overall to a Errol Spence versus Terrence Crawford. I don't think that Jermell Charlo, I don't think that he would really have a realistic chance of beating either of those fighters. I don't think that he's really that skilled. It just is what it is. You know, that's not me saying that he's not an A-grade fighter, but he's an A- fighter. Dimitri Bivol, in my view, and Artur Beterbiev for their weight classes, in my view, they're bigger and dangerous fighters, or more dangerous fighters. But it is what it is. Anyway.
Didn't win in this fight. With the facts being laid out, drop your thoughts in the comment section below. Subscribe below.
But anyways, that's really about it for this conversation today. I just thought that I would talk about that because I thought that that was very particularly interesting. But anyways, that's really about it for today. Thanks so much for watching. And we'll see how this fight transpires if overall it does end up happening. I'm going to be very interested. And of course, we have some great fights to talk about in these next few weeks. Tyson Fury versus Dillian White. Shakur Stevenson versus Oscar Valdez. I believe Miss Amanda Serrano versus Miss Katie Taylor. And of course, then after that, we have Canelo Alvarez versus Dimitri Bivol. So we have a lot to talk about later on down the line, but we'll see what happens. Anyways, that's really about it for today. Thanks so much for watching. We'll talk to you all later.